Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in System Center Technologies. Today's discussion is part 5 of an ongoing series talking about software updates in Configuration Manager 2012. Today, part 5, we turn to a discussion of internals on the client side. So up till now, we have certainly walked through the site server, talked about the internals of the site server, been on the client side, seen some of the activity in the UI, and so forth. So today we're going to spend some time digging into the client side processing of software updates. So this is the way the discussion will flow. First, I want to talk about some client components, just in review, the components that actually work together to make software updating work. Go through the software update scanning process, the different components involved there. Walk through in general the software update installation process. Finally, finish up with a discussion of tracking software updates as they run through the logs to aid with our troubleshooting and so on. So first stop on the client components. So yes, we've talked about these components in various forms before, but it's worth a review again just to talk about some of these things in relation to actually getting the job of software update dating done on the client side, right? So the first one is the Windows Update Agent. So we in the Config Manager client world leverage the Windows Update Agent to do all of the update work, whether it's scanning or installing the update. Is all done through the Windows Update Agent. Now, it may not seem readily apparent because we certainly have our own logs, as you'll see in a bit, where we install the updates and so on, but ultimately we're handing off to the Windows Update Agent. So it goes without saying that the Windows Update Agent must be the minimum supported version for Config Manager 2012 at least. Not generally an issue on the later OSs, but one thing that does raise is upgradability of the Windows Update Agent, because using the latest version is always recommended, right? So in Config Manager, before we even get to Config Manager, in a pure WSUS environment, the agent upgrade is handled automatically through the WSUS server. When there's a new update, it will deploy those updates out to the Windows Update agents that are there on clients. It just works. In Configuration Manager, though, we disable the ability to do automatic updating of the Windows Update agent is essentially turned off. It doesn't work, right? So the question comes up sometimes, how do you actually go about updating the Windows Update agent? And the answer is there's a bit of a manual process of running the executable with some command line switches and so on, but ultimately you should do that on occasion to update those agents that are out of date, right? You could do that through a command line package or something like that. Because Windows Update Agent is like any other code, there are updates from time to time to fix issues, to add new things to the mix, and so it's always a good idea to keep the Windows Update Agent installed up to date. Okay. Another component that often isn't talked about so much, maybe, or thought about, especially in the Config Manager mindset, is the Windows Update Data Store. So on the client, in fact, let me just go ahead and bring this in. I wasn't going to do it yet, but I'll go ahead and bring the lab in now. On the client, the Windows Update Agent folder structure lives under the Windows folder. So if I go under Windows and I go down to Software Distribution, right here, this is the folder structure for the Windows Update Agent. There's a number of things in here, including the data store. And the data store is essentially an EDB file, right? This database file hosts information about the software updates that have been applied to the machine, that are needed by the machine, the scan results, that kind of thing. So knowing where that is, at least it's helpful to know that's the store ultimately that's responsible for the scan results that we absorb in Config Manager. So when we, for example, go to a scan, we're going to point the Windows Update Agent at the WSUS server, software update point, that we discover, so it can synchronize the latest update, metadata, that kind of thing, know what to scan for, and then we get the results back. Right? I'll show you that process in a minute. Okay, the software update client component, this is what drives the client action. So we've talked about the features of this component before. Let me go back through it for just calling your attention back. So if we go under default client settings as an example, the first place we'll start is computer agent, right? Now there is a setting here to be aware of. Again, we've talked about it before, but just to call it out, disable deadline randomization. So when you deploy a software update, you set a deadline at which it needs to install, right? Now, notice this is not under software updates, it's under computer agents, but it certainly applies to software updates. You set a deadline at which those software updates need to install. Well, in order to allow for randomization of the installation on maybe virtual machines that are hosted by a single server, we have given you the option to disable deadline randomization. If you say, and that wording is just a little bit funny to me, but if you say no, then that means that we are not disabling the deadline randomization, which means that whenever you deploy an update, if you tell it the deadline for install is maybe 1 a.m., then we have anywhere between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. There's a 4-hour randomization window in there at which we could actually do the install. So if you want predictable installs, which you will if you're wanting things like maintenance windows, or you might just want them in general, you want to turn this off, and it is off by default. Right? There are some other settings here under software updates. We've talked about them before just briefly. You have to enable software updates on the clients in order for software updating to work. Here's where you set your routine scan schedule so that we know the latest updates. Redeployment, so if some update gets removed that you've previously sent out as required, and that deployment is still active, then we'll redeploy the update at that time. And then this one is actually really good for user experience. So if you have a number of updates queued up, right, and maybe there's 3 updates queued up. The deadline for one is tomorrow, the deadline for the next is the day after tomorrow, and the deadline for the third is the day after tomorrow, perhaps. Then what you can do is you can select that when the deadline is reached for the first one, if there are other updates pending that will have a deadline soon, and you can set the period of time to look out right here, just go ahead and install them all, right? Don't disrupt the user more than once. Just go ahead and look into the future, whatever time frame you configure, and install all of them at the same time, right, in the same window. Cool, so those are the client settings. Then we also have a critical component will be the ConfigMgr client cache. That is not just for software updates, it's for any kind of deployment that has binary files that need to be installed on the client. So having proper space in the cache, proper size of the cache, that kind of thing important. Again, that's pretty old hat, right? WMI, a very critical component for really any component of ConfigMgr, and certainly software updates is no different. Here is where we store the configuration settings for the software update agent. It's also where we store the update scan and compliance results as they are being reported back to the site server, and then we persist them here. It's also where we store any and all update deployments, jobs, that kind of thing, and I'll show you that in a minute. How you can get into WMI and learn a bit about what's set there, and so on, right? Then we have the software update binary itself. So this is the file that you want to download and install on your system. So I didn't really put it here. I call it out later. But when you deploy software updates, there's actually 2 components that you need to get, that you need to have available for you. One is the metadata. The other is the actual binary. So the metadata describes the detail about the update, what it is, how the applicability and detection rules work, and that kind of thing. Then we have the binary. So once we determine that the software update needs to be installed, we can use the binary to actually do the install. Again, much like a package, application, whatever. Last thing is the SQL CE database, right? So I'll go ahead and show these to you now. So we do have on the client, I've mentioned this before, we do have on every 2012 client, we have a SQL database, right? So if we look under the CCM folder, in fact, here we go. Let me scroll up. That's what I'm doing wrong. Okay. If we look under the CCM folder and the search for an SDF extension, then we'll see that not only do we have the one database, CCM store, that I talked about in previous discussions, but we have 5 databases on the client that describe information on the client. Now, these databases are not things that you generally need to worry about, but they're here just so you know. And so between WMI and these SQL databases are all the data that we need to go through and do the work that we have to get done. I'll go show you the CCM store database in just a bit. In fact, let me just go ahead and do that now so I don't forget. So if I close this down and go over to the site server, I can launch SQL, and I'm actually doing this out of sequence, but again, I don't want to forget to show you. I can launch SQL and go open this CE database. So this is the path to my database. Now, let me say that on the database here, this is for information. You don't need to change this. You don't need to modify it. If anything goes wrong in here, don't try to fix it. It's far easier to just reinstall the client, let the client fix itself. But it's also helpful to understand how the pieces fit together. So I'll show it to you. If you want to explore this, you can. All you have to do is open the file. I copied it over so that it's not a live file. But you can see there are the various tables here. Not many, but there are some. And if I do a simple select query, select star from configuration items, which is the parent table, and run that, oops, typing mistakes, and run that, then I will get all of the configuration items currently in the system. Well, I don't have that many, but the one thing to call out is notice that there are a number of different types here. There's operating system CIs, there's baselines for compliance settings, there could be applications here if I had any applications deployed, and there's a number of software update deployments. This particular number, remember D4A, you'll see that again, and that is a unique update ID for one of the updates that we're going to see in the logs, right? So that's there, and you can explore the other tables too. I won't take time to do it, but again, just another caution. Look, don't touch, don't change. There's no need for you to go in here. This is kind of a hands-off thing, but it does help you understand the system a bit to know at this level what it's doing, right? Okay, so let's move on. Now, the first thing that I want to do in terms of breaking this down and understanding how this works is talk about the scan process, right? So I put up this little flow chart here to try to describe the scan process, how that works. The scan process is something we can run independently. Every 7 days by default, you saw as the schedule. It's also something that runs as a part of software update deployment, right? So understanding how it works is important. So the first thing on the line is the way that the scan has been requested. It could be either a manual trigger of the scan, it could be something that happens on a schedule. Either way is fine, the process is the same. The next thing in line after that you'll see in a minute is that in order to do a scan, the scan engine for us is the Windows Update agent, which needs to get its information from a WSUS server, software update point, in the Configuration Manager world. And in order to do that, we have to find out what is the location of the WSUS server we need. Well, you might think, why are we making a location request? Why can't we just put that in through policy? Well, I'll talk about that again a little bit more in a minute, but in terms to answer the question, why are we making a location request? Remember, clients could roam around. If you have a laptop client or a tablet these days, Surface Pro, whatever, you could be moving around from office to office, could be at a different primary site, could be within the boundaries of a secondary site that has a local WSUS server. So we definitely want to be able to leverage the local WSUS server, software update point, if there is one, right? Which there should be. And if there's not a local one, we'll go back to whatever the most logical one is based on the algorithm we have. But there's another part of this too. So in Service Pack 1, we introduced the ability to have multiple software update points at a single site. So if you have a single primary site with 5 or 6 or 3 or 4 software update points, whatever, 2 or 3, we need a location request to be able to identify which one makes sense for us to use and pick between the ones that are available, that kind of thing. So location request is very important, right? Now, there are some implications with location request and policy. Again, I'll talk about those in a minute, but just know that's there. So once we have the location of our WSUS server software update point, then the scan agent will get involved to call into Windows Update agent to actually do the scan, right? And these, to be clear, are kind of interchangeable. So scan agent is the first component that gets called to ask for location. So really, I probably should have switched these two, but they really work in tandem. Scan agent gets kicked off next, calls for the location of WSUS, hands that over to the Windows Update agent by recording it on the client so the Windows Update agent has it, that kind of thing. The Windows Update agent actually does the scan. So the Windows Update agent scan is initiated. There's a few things. So Windows Update.log, that is a log specific to the Windows Update agent, tracks the progress of our scan. The ConfigMgr client log WUA Handler tracks the scan process. So it looks like, and I very often go to WUA Handler just to watch what's going on, because frankly it's easier to read than Windows Update log. But just know Windows Update is actually the one doing the scan. Then we have finally the Windows Update verbose logging. So if you have a need for additional logging on your system to understand what's going on in the update process, the scanning process, we can add some additional logging into the Windows Update log process to see that. And I'll show you that in a minute. Right. Once we get done, the scan results are stored in either WMI or the datastore.edb we saw. The WMI will be for the ConfigMgr client. This datastore.edb is for the Windows Update agent. And then ultimately the state messages about the scan results are reported back to the site server in ConfigMgr. Right? So that's end-to-end what the software update process looks like. Now, let's go actually see it live. I'm sorry, that's end-to-end what the software update scanning process looks like. Now let's go see it live. All right, so if I pull in my lab here, then I'll be able to walk through that process. So I'll go to a Windows 8 machine. Now, I've already actually saved this off in the log files, but I'll show you. If I go into the control panel and launch my client applet, then I can start off the scan cycle either manually by kicking off the scan cycle, or it could be a scheduled scan, or it could be a scan that's a part of the software update process, so that's why I have it, right? Now, so these logs are the ones that are relevant to the scanning process. So whenever I click, in my case, I click the scan agent or initiate a software update scan, it's going to open and begin that process. You'll see it in this log, right? So if I go to the top, there were a couple of misfires here where I didn't quite have things configured yet. But let's see, along about here, here we've, oops, that's a little bit too early. Oops, here we go. I'm getting too far down in the log. All right. Let's see. Okay, so we see the first line here, scan by update source is called. I clicked on it, it's manual, so we're initiating the scan, we're inside the scan. And one of the first things we do is we have to go out and find the WSUS server we should be talking to, right? We just talked about that. Well, in order to do that, I'm going to create and send a location request. This location request ID is actually handing off to the location services log, which I could pull up here. You can pull up. It's not unique to software updates. It's a way that we find either content, WSUS server, whatever. And in location services log, you'll see the interchange, as long as you have verbose and debug logging turned on, the interchange of information as we send it to the management point, get a response back from the management point, and find out who our WSUS server is. So if we scroll down a little bit more, you'll see that we have received actually the location request results. And here, in fact, is our software update point WSUS server that we're going to be talking to for this scan, right? And then the rest of it just works off. Ultimately, you'll see that the scan is completed. Get execution status. You'll see one down here, completed in a bit. Anyway, it's down there. And the actual way that here we go, update it, scan completed successfully. So once we get the locations and store them, then we have those available for the Windows Update agent. The next login line that we would look at on the ConfigMgr client side is the Windows Update agent handler log, right? So if I open this one up and scroll to the top, then we can go through here. Here we find that again we're referencing the WSUS server that we know about, and then we're going to start scanning. So notice this, async search of update started, and then notice the timestamp. Have a little bit of a difference here, about a little bit over a minute of difference between these two entries. And then we have a completed entry. So that's just kind of a tangent point. As you're looking through these logs, the timestamp really, really is helpful. So pay attention to it, right? If you're looking for activity to begin, there likely will be a noticeable break in timestamps in the log. If you're looking for maybe where one component hands off to another, there will be a timestamp in the log. There's also another trick for figuring out which components talk to which and hand off between that I'll show you in a minute, but that's a good indication too. So now we have the results of doing the scan, and we see all of the updates that are superseded by others. Notice this ID, this GUID looking thing. This is a unique update ID, right? So in the logs, you will find these unique update IDs all over, right? So it's helpful to be able to translate these unique update IDs to understand what update they're actually referencing. In some of the logs, you will see the friendly name of the update, but not all the time. So here, let me just show you a quick way to map that. If I go to the software library and look for software updates, and look at my software update group content, there we go. Notice that I have, well, I'll just do it here. Show members. Yeah, right here. So you notice that I have a unique update ID column I added. This is not there by default, but this will translate the software update to the actual GUID. Again, pay attention to the D4A, you'll see that again. But right now we're just going through and looking at those different updates, saying what supersedes what, so that we're only going to report the right data, we have the relationships intact, and so on. So if we scroll down, we'll get to a section after this shortly where we actually see the results of the scan. Here we are, right? So what the update name is, the friendly name, here's the ID again, and what its status is, missing or not missing, or whatever else, right? Well, you look through here and you see that generally the only updates that you see are the ones that apply to the system. Well, that's true. Absolutely true. Little tangent here. We will filter out the updates that apply to the given system and report those out, right? So one of the things that I see a lot is customers will target updates to systems that will never apply to that system. That's fine. It's not going to affect the scanning results. It's all good, and the system's engineered to handle it. But still, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me to target updates to a system that you know will never need the update. Case in point, if you have a Windows Server 2003 box, why would you ever target Windows 2008 updates to it? It's never going to need it. It's just extra stuff that has to be stored in WMI, potentially processed, could maybe skew your results for compliance, whatever else. But here you see that we are only really going to be calling in updates that are for the platform that we're on. And now just another pointer, this kind of level of detail you don't get unless you have verbose and debug logging turned on. But generally it's not necessary either. There's other tools that can help you get this. So not too long ago, ConfigMgr 2007 really, and even RTM of 2012, I was kind of really on the bandwagon of verbose and debug logging for the client all the time, because there's certain things you don't get in the logs without that level of detail. In 2012, that's still true, right? And in certain troubleshooting scenarios, you definitely need verbose and debug logging, but we give you enough detail through some of the other toolkit tools, that kind of thing, that you really largely don't need to have verbose and debug logging turned on. It's still a good idea if you want to always have at your fingertips the detail that you need to see, but it's not as much of a requirement anymore, though in some cases you definitely still need it. Anyway, this is the Windows Update Agent Handler showing the results of the scan. But you'll notice that if you go into the Windows Update Agent log, and I don't recall why I have several of them, I'll just go to this one and look through this log, you will definitely see that the work of the scan is being done here. So we'll call in to the system to start the scan up, and you'll see, start the service scan. We'll scroll down a little bit, and initializing the global settings cache, initializing Windows Update Agent, so it's starting up, and you can read through this thing ad nauseum and learn a lot of detail about the flow of things. Now we're going to start searching for all updates, right? And a little detail about the system that we're searching on and that kind of thing, right? And we're starting up the automatic update search, and off we go, right? Well, we can read through all this and so on. One of the interesting things is if I search for CCMexec, we're going to find that down here, right? So I skipped over a lot for some early things, but basically we see initializing the automatic update agent. This went down a bit. This time, the reason it jumped is because in this scan, it's actually being initiated by the config manager client, CCMexec, right? You can see it right here, initializing the scan, starting through. Here's who called in. We're starting the search. Here's the OS version, right? And we're going to start up finding the updates. Okay, here's the WSUS client URL that we have. You know it is because of the 8530 and so on, right? And then we can simply go through and we're going to synchronize any extended update information, so making sure our database is up to date and so on. So spend some time doing that. These are the unique update IDs. And then ultimately we will be done with the process and report that out. So we're good, right? And that's how the config manager client gets its update information, right? Now, that's all well and good, but there may be times that you actually need to have a little bit more. Let me go over here for some additional considerations before I jump back into this next part. So when you're doing the software update scanning, there are some things to understand, right? That's the basic update scan. You get the scan request, scan agent wakes up, calls in, gets the locations come back to scan agent calls into Windows Update Agent, that does the scan, tracked by Windows Update Agent Handler, and it's pretty simple workflow. But it may not always be that simple. It's not hard really in many scenarios, but if you are maybe in an internet client versus intranet client, there's a little bit of a different hoops that we jump through. Again, it's not that hard. If you have multiple software update points, which we have in Service Pack 1 Plus, you can have multiple software update points at a site, then there's additional information about finding the right software update point and possibly failing over to a software update point if yours has your assigned one has failed, that kind of thing. Those are in the logs. We can track them, but you get the general idea. All right. So one of the things that was a challenge, and sometimes I see it crop up still, is administrators who assign a WSUS server by group policy, right? If you have a WSUS server assigned by group policy, the config manager client is going to realize that and back off, right? The common error message would be overridden by higher authority in the logs, because we know that policy is a higher authority than we are, so we're letting policy take control. In general, you just don't want to assign the WSUS server by policy. Let the config manager client figure out what WSUS server to use based on its location, based on the location request. That's just the right way to do it. That's how the client's designed, right? So just be aware of that. Also showed you the software distribution the software distribution folder. Well, there's some implications for troubleshooting of this folder. So one of the things, let me just pull it back in so you can see it. One of the things in articles that you'll read around the web, news groups, that kind of thing, is people who have trouble with software update scanning or whatever. One of the things they'll be asked to do is just delete this folder, right? Well, oftentimes if you delete the folder, it works the next time you scan. Well, why is that? One of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons is inside this folder is the data store and this database file. If there's any corruption in this file, if there's any problems there, we basically reconstruct it and start fresh, right? Which is maybe a good thing. Maybe it will clear some issues, that kind of thing. So that's cool. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you here, just to pull over, is talk about this Windows Update verbose logging, right? So it's useful just to know what's going on. It's also pretty useful to track maybe some update detection logic and know how it's been applied in the environment. And Windows Update Agent verbose logging is something easily turned on in the registry. So I've opened regedit and go in. I'm already opened up to the location. It's this key, right? And what you need to do is you need to add a key called trace. This is not here by default. And then inside trace, we need to add two DWORD values, level and flags. and set the value accordingly. So we want to set the hex value to 16 in this case, and the hex value of level to 3. Once I do that, then verbose and debug logging is turned on. Now, it's different than ConfigMgr verbose logging because it can put a bit of a load on the system while it runs. Well, ConfigMgr can too. But I never have a problem leaving ConfigMgr verbose debug logging turned on just in production. You may or may not want to do that with Windows Update verbose logging. It does add a lot of data to the Windows Update log. It's your call, right? But just be aware of that. Now, so here is another set of logs where I have done another scan, and this log does have verbose logging turned on in the Windows Update log. It's taking a little bit longer to load, right? And so as I look through this, you're going to see there's some interesting things here. Now, I'm not going to go through every piece of this, but one section that's particularly interesting, I'll just go ahead and search for it here and jump down to it, that we did not have in the other one, is, there we go. So you'll see an entire block here, right? So after we go through the update, synchronizing updates with the server, whatever, we're going to go through and check all the updates that we know about and find out, are they applicable? Are they superseded? Are they installed? Are they installable? That kind of thing. So you see us checking right here all the details. Now, you don't necessarily see the logic behind what does it mean it's superseded, what does it mean it's installed, what does it mean on these different conditions, but we're definitely checking them. And you will see as we scroll down certain information like what registry keys we're checking and what file system entries we're checking. I'm just scrolling. A lot of these might be MSIs, so we're just checking for MSI codes. Here's a reg expression that we're trying to evaluate, right? So if I look here, we're looking for a superseded rule. We're going to look for whether the rule is whether we're installed, that kind of thing. So you can definitely see places here that we're looking in the file system, in the registry, and different things for different logic to know what to do, right? But even if we didn't, even if it's just a true or false, this would be a really useful place to go for troubleshooting. So let me give you one scenario. So one scenario I dealt with a while back was that an update was installing, absolutely installing, but it was constantly saying it was not installed. It was needed. Well, why is that? Because what had happened in this case, it was a SQL server, and at some point, I don't know all of the details how it got into the state, but at some point there were some fragments of SQL Server on the C drive. Well, then SQL Server was actually in production installed on a different drive, E, we'll call it. Well, when the update ran, the detection logic for the update actually being there was based on what was stored in a registry key. So that registry key was actually saying that the install drive was C. So sure enough, whenever the detection logic ran to find out is this update installed, it looked at the C drive because that's what the registry said. And in fact, that update was not installed on the C drive. That updated file was not installed on the C drive. But if you went to the E drive, that updated file provided by the update or whatever files were actually there. So it truly was installed, but because of some misconfiguration of the registry and whatever, the detection logic was saying that it wasn't installed, right? So a temptation oftentimes is, if it says uninstalled, or I'm sorry, if it says that an update's not installed but you know it is, just to bypass that server or system and move on. When in reality, there's either a problem with the logic on the detection logic or whatever on the update, or there's actually something wrong with the system that is trying to be detected against, so that we just aren't finding it right. Either way, it's something that would be good to dig into, right? Okay, enough of that for now. Let me move that back out of the way, pull this out, and we'll move on. All right, so that's software update scanning. Talked about the verbosity, how that's helpful in some situations as well. So now let's move on and actually go through the software update installation process, see how we can track that in the logs. All right, so let's move to the next slide. Okay, so I break this down into two things. First is the general understanding of the software update installation process, and then I want to break it down into the software update installation tracking, going log by log and looking at how it works, right? So in terms of the software installation process, want to start here because it's something always good to keep in your mind about how this particular process works, right? So if once we get to the logs, we're going to see that it's really a pile of tangled spaghetti how these logs interact. So it's easy to get lost perhaps in those logs if you don't remember the general process of what we're trying to go through. So it goes without saying, but if you're installing a software update, this is kind of the process you go through. You're going to initiate that deployment on the client, right? And then you're going to have a need to do the compliance scan. Well, why do we do a compliance scan after we initiate the install? Well, the answer is that we don't want to install the update if it actually has already been installed. So we scan for it to make sure. And then after that, we're going to go acquire, if it's needed, we're going to acquire the information that is needed to actually do the install. Now, when you think about it, doing an install, you think maybe that there's binary files that you need to download from the distribution board. That's certainly true. But that's not the only thing. So whenever we're going to acquire content, there's two things we need. The binaries for sure, but then also the configuration item definitions, the metadata that describes these updates that we're going to be applying, right? Those two come down. They're two separate things. Once we get that, we're going to install any of the applicable updates and finally report it, the status of that, to the site server. So that's generally the flow we think about. But then the question is, okay, how do we actually get the work done to install a software update? And that's where we get into the log files, right? And I put this up here kind of jumbled on purpose because there's no real clear way that I can say component 1 goes to component 2, goes to component 3, goes to component 4. It just doesn't work that way. Component 1 may hand off to component 4, then may hand off to component 3, then come back to component 1, and it just interacts that way as we work to get the job done, right? But if you know where we are, where we're having problems, where we want to track, it's not really that hard to hone in on things. So to try to give some order to it, I actually lined it up like this. And these entries, there's actually more than this, but these are the major ones that you'll see show up in the logs. The ones that I've highlighted in yellow, these are the key logs, as I would call them. The others are kind of supportive. They don't just work in software updates. Update Store does. It's not a major one, so I didn't put it in yellow. But all the others, these are shared components for other, or shared components that other components on the client will use. So if you're deploying applications, you'll see CI agent, you'll see SC client, you'll see location services, CAS, all these things, data transfer service. If you're deploying a compliance setting baseline, you'll definitely see CI agent, SC client perhaps, you'll see all of these, right? CI downloader. The ones in yellow are unique to software updates. Well, even the top one, CCM SDK provider, that's not unique to software updates either. It's a key component that starts the thing off, but let me correct myself there. CCM SDK provider is not unique to software updates. The other ones in yellow are. So we'll look at this. The other thing I want to show you in WMI are just some key WMI namespaces for software updating that we'll call out. And then I've already shown you, I went ahead and jumped ahead to the local CE database, so I won't show you that again. But let's take a look at the logs in a demo. So we'll pull the lab in here. All right. So now what I've done is I've actually got a software update group deployment going on. This only has 3 updates in it, as you saw. I've already installed one, but I've got a deployment just to have something to work through. And on my client, if I go into Software Center, close all this down, you'll see in fact that I have a deployment here. Now, I've already got logs saved off just because it's easier to save them off and work through them that way. I can install this here, no problem. Actually, here's my installation. I can install this here, no problem. It's going to go through the process, no worries while it does that. But we'll just look at these updates, this update installing in the log. So if you go in and look at the structure here, I'm specifically calling out a time here that I want to trace. So let's call our attention back to what I mentioned earlier, where when you're looking through these logs, it really is important to be able to line these things up by time. Now, So I can sort by date modified. That's what I'll do here. Because I know, just because I wrote it in the name of the folder, that 1134, almost right on the dot, is when things start up. So I'm going to show you a trick that will help you kind of understand how these logs weave together. You saw that jumble of components, how you can make sense of that. Now, what I want to do is also call your attention to the fact that these timestamps, while they're good, they may not always identify every log that you need to pull in. So 1134, you see a bunch of them here, but if you scroll down, you'll see one down here, Updates Handler says 1131. Well, I know that's wrong. In fact, if you open up this log and look, you'll see that there's logging at 1134. Point is, this timestamp may not always be right. It should update now that I've done that, but you can start there. So let me show you what I'm going to do here to identify this. If I'm approaching this fresh and I don't have any idea what particular components, what particular logs are going to describe to me the activity that takes place, then I can frankly take all of my current log files and just weave them together in CM Trace. Right? So I'll open CM Trace here. File open. I could go in and take all of these logs, make sure I'm looking at the right one, take all of these logs and weave them together based on the timestamp, based on the most recent logs, and I will definitely have all of the conversation, right? A lot of junk that I don't need, but all of the conversation. Or if I know generally the time that I'm looking at, I can just choose the ones that I care about. Or if I know the log files that are involved pretty well, I can just choose all of the relevant ones. In this case, I'm just going to select to merge these selected files and also go down and get Update Handler. It's down here, Update Handler. All right, and say open. So it's going to merge these things together. So with the timestamp, knowing that everything starts at 1134, I can go down here and find 1134 and then go back up and start to work through these logs to understand what took place. Right now, I'm going to show you this really quickly and then go and actually make the view a little bit crisper with just some relevant logs. But you can see the first thing involved CCM SDK provider. Right? It sees that there is some activity. We're going to go check and see if a reboot is pending. This is our first handoff. We go to another component called Reboot Coordinator, come right back to CCM SDK Provider, start going through, and we're going to work on this update. Well, you see this is the update ID I've referenced, D4A. Right? So I know right away I can tie this log back to the update that I actually care about installing. Then there's a lot more that goes on. So I mentioned there's 2 points at which we need to acquire content. The first is CI content, the metadata. The other is that we need to get the actual binaries for install. Right? Well, that's where you see CI agent coming in and deciding, do we need to get certain things? And then we see update store and update handler and all of this coming in. Right? So you see the SC client, this software center client coming in and weaving through and telling us what's being displayed and changed and whatever in software center. There's a lot of activity. So you see just from 1134 to the end of this, there's a lot of stuff that's going on, right? So knowing the logs that are relevant, the key ones that I pulled out, I'm going to try to clear the picture up a little bit and only pull in those that are involved in this, right? And then we can follow it a little bit clearer. So if I go to merge the log files, and this time I'm going to pull in specific ones that I know are involved. So I'm going to go get, for example, CAS, and then I'm going to go get CCM SDK provider. Then I'm going to scroll down and get CI agent. I'm going to bypass CI state store, CI downloader, all of those. I'm going to bypass because they're kind of extraneous. You can look at them, be aware that they're there, but really there's not often that you're going to see issues, at least historically, with the CI acquisition. Right? So I'm going to get Content Transfer Manager and Data Transfer Service just for a complete chat of what's going on. Go on through. I'm going to get, what else do I want? Make sure I don't miss anything. Go get Scan Agent. I'm also going to get the, let's see, What else? What else? What else? What else? Updates handler, update deployment, right? And then the WUA handler. And that's really it. I'm going to open those up, merge them together, and you'll see still a decent amount of logging. But if we go to 1134 now, it's got a lot below, but it's far less than what we started with, right? So if I go up to the natural break here, 1134, I can see right here that we're starting up, right? Still, we see determinative of reboots pending. We don't see the reboot coordinator because I did not select it. And then we can work on through and find out that, we're working on this update. We're going to make sure that it's available to us, and then we're going to start working on the install. Well, right away, whenever we start the install, we're handing off to updates deployment agent, which also is interacting with updates handler. So you see, we start the install. First thing we have to do is we need to check for applicability in a scan. So updates handler is going to be handing off to scan agent, just like we saw, right? So you see how these components kind of roll together all in line, and there's crosstalk back and forth between these. So whenever we called the scan right here, checking for applicability, we see right here apply CIs, the job ID, back and forth as we talk. The scan agent kicks off. Here's the updates handler just reporting back. We're doing the scan. Updates handler is keeping up to date, saying we successfully requested it or initiated it. Going back and forth, CCM SDK provider now keeping track of what's going on, right? Back and forth we go, and so on, right? So we could go line by line. We're going to go apply the SDMs. That's part of the CI kind of packaging that needs to go on. We're going to go through, and again, here's the scan agent. We're evaluating the update status, whatever. Updates handler, again, we completed the scan. We're continuing to move on. And we can just keep going to the logs. There's a lot of detail here. You can see very, very verbose information about what's going on. And then ultimately, we're going to get past this part to where we need to go install the updates themselves. Let me move down to that level. And yeah, I know I'm skipping over a lot of logs. I'm doing that on purpose because if I went line by line by line, it would really start to get boring and I would lose you anyway. So I just encourage you in your own environment to weave these logs together. Watch what's going on. Read them line by line. It really would be worth the time to see what's going on, learn how the system works. Ultimately, so we have the CIs we need to get in place. We've done that. Now we need to go and get the actual updates themselves. So here we see that we're going to go get the updates. And we know that because content access, CAS, has come into play. That's where we go find content on the distribution point. Here is the status of the distribution point where we can go get this. And then content access, just like other components, hands off to its child processes. So the next one it hands off to is Content Transfer Manager. CAS is, well, let me pause for a minute. These components on the client, they're what I call, my term only, kind of umbrella services. And then there's, or umbrella components, and there's other components that sit under the umbrella. CCM SDK provider is kind of that umbrella component. Updates handler, updates deployment, whatever, are kind of that umbrella. There's other components that they call into to get their job done. Well, CAS is that umbrella component for content acquisition. It starts the process of acquiring content, but to get the job done, it hands off to location services and content transfer manager and data transfer service. Data transfer service is the one that actually gets the data. But all of these talk back and forth and keep each other updated about what's going on. So here you see that we're going to download data. Well, Content Transfer Manager doesn't do that. It's Data Transfer Service that actually does that. From the DP, you can watch it happen, right? If you had verbose and debug logging turned on, you would see even more. You can see the individual files come down, whatever. And then as we roll along, we will finally see the updates get installed. If I can get down to Windows Update Handler, we'll see some synchronous searching of updates. We'll see the installation of updates started. We don't see the real detail about the installation of updates here because we don't have verbose and debug logging turned on, but suffice it to say, once we get done with that, we're through, right? So you see the entire process end to end. The part of the process that you don't see is in the Windows Update Agent log. Let's see. I think I might have that here. Nope. Let me go see if I can show an example of that from the recent update that we just installed. So let me go back to where that is and look here. Windows Software Distribution. Down here. All right. And then we, oops, sorry, forgot. It's at the same level. Windows Update log. So let's go to where it's going to take a minute to load. Let's go to where it actually is installing. I'll pause the video so you don't have to watch that bar, and I'll come right back. All right, so here you can actually see in the Windows Update log, this is still with verbose logging turned on. It actually took quite a while to load. That's why I recommend, be careful with it. But you can see the installation of the update. You can see the name of the update, the ID, that kind of thing. You can see the progress from the CBS component of the system. The Windows operating system actually assists with the load and whatever. You can see it finish and different things, right? So it is absolutely here if you need to troubleshoot an installation problem. Certainly the WUA Handler log is a great place to start, but there's other places as well that can give you even more detail, right? Okay, so now let's. There's a couple other places I want to look at. Let me go to WMI, and we'll take a look at those few namespaces I want to show you. All right, so I still like using WebMTest. There are other tools out there that can help you look at WMI repository, but I kind of have a knee-jerk back to WebMTest. So we'll launch that up. And there's 5 namespaces I want to show you just to give you a feel for what kind of data is in here, right? Not to be exhaustive, but just to show you. So if I'm going to start with the policy namespace. So whenever the client enables the software updates agent or gets new deployments or whatever, this is where that detail is stored to show you what the client has to do. So if I go to root CCM policy machine actual config. All right. Oops, what did I do? Typo. There we go. Enum classes, recursive, and go down to the CCM Update CI assignments. You will see all of the updates that have been assigned to this particular system, right? Here's just one assignment ID. But in that assignment ID, you see a number of updates. So WebMTest is not the best editor, but you can easily pull out the information in here to look at it in Notepad or something that's easier. Paste that in. And we have word wrap turned off, I believe. And so you see a lot of the detail. You see exactly which updates are here. You see a little bit more information, the applicability rules kind of reference, though it's hard to decipher them here. And all of the updates themselves that are part of this assignment are listed here. So again, do you need to go into this detail normally? No. But if you need this kind of level of detail when you're troubleshooting to confirm things, whatever, it's here. You can go in here and see the assignment name, right, of the assignment, whatever, and all the detail about it. All right, so that's one place. So also, if you want to see what update source, not really as important in 2012, but still worth seeing. If you want to see the update source, meaning where are we getting the details of our updates, then you can go in here and look and see that it's a WSUS enterprise server that is our update source. Now, there were other update sources that you could use in ConfigMgr. Maybe there are still some third parties that I'm not aware of, but a good example is in ConfigMgr 2007, we had the ability to use the SMS 2003 backwards compatible for the update source, that kind of thing, so it would be showing up in here as well. And the reason this is important is we will always reference the update source that we're using whenever we do a scan. We'll tell you that it's WSUS2, but it's still interesting to know where it is. Now, once we get the assignment and start processing the assignment, the actual updates themselves, there's a software update namespace that we can connect to. So we modify this, go back to software updates, and then there's actually 4 under here. We'll start with deployment agent. All right, and then under here there's just one entry we'll look at, but specifically, and mine's not a very busy system, that's why there's not more, but we can look at all of the targeted updates right here. Right, look at the instance of it, and we see that there are actually 3 updates targeted. Well, that's interesting. Why? Because if you look back in the update list, in fact, let's go do it, or the software update group. If you go back to the software update group and look inside this, you will see, in fact, that there are 3 software updates that are targeted to this particular machine. Right, and so we list them all out here. You can look at detail about them by clicking on it, showing MOF, seeing different settings about it, right, and how it's configured. You can even go in and look to see if all of these updates are applicable, not applicable, installed, whatever, right? But it's there. There's another location that I'll show you real quick. So if I connect in here, go to update status, or I'm sorry, update store. So update store is where we store the status for our various updates. So if I go down to CCM Update Status, a little bit further down, a little bit further up, see, there we go, Update Status, Instances, then I will be able to look at every update that this system knows about and see the status for it, right? So I could use my unique ID if I wanted to sift through this. Maybe I'll get lucky and see the D4, whatever it was, that we were looking at, and I could click on it and see the status. Is this it, B4A? Let's see, show them off. It'll tell me right away, is it installed, what is it, that kind of thing. What's the product ID? Is it missing? So this one's missing, that was the wrong one. All right, and stuff in here. So very useful for tracking, right? And then the last thing that I'll show you is back in the WUA Handler namespace. So let me back up here. There, and connect in here, and then classes, go back to recursive, whatever. Then I showed you the update source. We're just going to have WSUS in this environment. But if you were to have a question about what the update source was that you were using, you can go into CCM Update Source and find that out. I keep going past it. CCM Update Source. There we go. Instances. Here you can tell it is WSUS. Now, how do you know that? You don't know that because it says WSUS. You know that because it is an update source. And you also see this URL with 8530 at the end, which is a port, default port for Windows Update WSUS server. All right, so that's really it, right? So that is admittedly a whirlwind kind of walkthrough of software updates, internals on the client, but hopefully helpful, right? So it was a whirlwind, yeah, I know that, but a lot of stuff to cover for sure, and no substitute for actually digging into it yourself on your own systems. But that's it, right? And there are a couple of extra topics I just want to touch on real quick. So won't really show it to you here. I'll go into it a bit in the next session, but I've already talked through it in one of the other sessions about toolkit for SP1. There's a deployment monitoring tool. So those details in WMI where we're looking at the status of the updates and whatever, it's a nicer tool to be able to look inside that and see the status of the updates in a nice UI, right? So you don't have to go into WMI. There's some other things just to mention, like distribution point access, the internet. So I've shown this to you before, but just to call it out again, in SP1 we added the ability for a client to retrieve updates from the internet in the event that they were not able to get back to the home infrastructure, right? And so that's a cool thing to factor in. We'll change the logs just a little bit. Showed, I believe, the logs last time. It really is in the content acquisition section that you would see that. Maintenance windows certainly factor in to whether an update will apply. Understanding strategy around that and using those effectively are important. And then just selective downloading. So again, mentioned it before, but in order for a client to obtain content, they can get it from whatever a software update deployment package has the content. So it is selective. If you have a software update deployment package with 900 updates and we only need 3, that's all we're downloading, right? So again, well-known kind of features that we've had even from 2007, Config Manager 2007, but worth talking about. So with that, we'll wrap up the session, and we will see you the next time.